welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod. So I know we've talked a lot on this channel about different animals and how to draw eyes and people and things like that, but I thought it'd be interesting to go in and discuss how to draw a cave. There's a lot of interesting things you can do with this particular style that I really like, and a lot of details you can add with a cave to make it more than just a simple cave, but to add emotion to it, to add a little layer of spookiness or eeriness to it. So let's get arting. So the first thing I did, obviously, just like with everything else, I sketched it out. And I have, just these sort of light, loose lines. I was also trying to indicate, and you can see the change in direction happening here, where I have these bumps coming up, where I was trying to indicate rock changes that I thought maybe as the rocks are getting bumpy, it might look a certain way, or adding texture onto the floor, because once I start adding the highlights and shadows, that's really going to allow that sort of texture to take off. And I end up separating it out by foreground, middle ground, and background. And you can kind of see that a bit in this first drawing, right, where I'm much more detailed through here and up with these guys up close, but I start spacing that out as I go back. And then start adding in the different layers. So the first layer is going to be just this section through here, where I chose a light source that was, in front of it and off to the left, as if either there's light coming in from the cave or that we had some sort of flashlight or something else. It doesn't really matter fully what the light source is, except keeping in mind how powerful the light source is. So much as I'm aware that I have a light source, I've chosen a light source, it's stationary, and I keep true to how I'm shadowing and highlighting based on that light source. So, as I'm coming in, you can see the bumps in the rock where bump goes into shadow. It's a little harder to see close up. It's easier to see back here. Bump goes into shadow, bump goes into shadow. And on that first layer, when I was first doing it, I hadn't quite settled on how I was going to do the floor. That actually comes in the very next layer, where I added more of that kind of foreground, where it's close to us, it's really catching the light, and the ground would also be catching the light, but maybe not this side. This side's kind of off to the left, light source is off to the left, so it's not really going to be catching as much light, assuming it's a directed glow, as opposed to a generalized glow, in which case it might be. I opted for it not to. And so we have sort of that foreground. There's, I think, one more layer of foreground to go before I go into what I'm really going to say is the middle ground here. But it's the same thing I do with any other drawing. I'm layering these up. I'm thickening up the drawing I've already done, because I have already decided the direction all of this is going to go, right? You can see it in the sketch, but that's also why at the end, the last thing I do is remove the sketch, is because the sketch is in the end going to sort of detract from the whole thing. And then, following the edges of the cave, as I go further back, I have to be careful on how I'm connecting all that together. And so here I would say is the last layer of what I would really consider foreground, even though some of that's going into shadow. So I was having a hard time, and in fact I missed this guy. He's in my next layer, this little stalactite mite thing. I was having a hard time sort of adding enough lines and being mindful of how I was separating this out and figuring out where my foreground, middle ground, and background were sort of kicking in. But, with atmospheric perspective, there's the idea that you create the illusion of depth by adding a sort of haziness to an image, or, making it not as saturated, dulling out the colors. Now, I'm only using white, so there is no changing of the colors, but a way to sort of add that haze and the sort of natural darkness the cave is going to be casting is by lessening out the lines. I'm not only lessening my pen pressure, but the further back I go, the more sparse the lines become, to create the illusion that it's descending into sort of a dark abyss. And now I'm going to add the highlight for this guy. And now we go on to working on kind of the middle ground. And I needed to be careful that all of this lined up, that there wasn't a jarring transition from one to the other, even though the light would be getting more and more sparse. As I lessen out those lines, I need to be careful that I'm not doing it in a way that causes this jarring sort of change. And then you can see really here, things are really starting to sparse out more as we're going further and further back into the cave. and then we start getting that background as we come in and eventually have it disappear. But my lines really lessen off, and you can see they're not all that straight, but in a cave they don't really have to be. For one, you're dealing with a rocky kind of texture, so it gives me a chance to add a little bit of wobble to the lines. But two, because of how I draw, your lines don't have to be straight. And it's something I very much believe. I've heard a lot of people say that they could never be an artist, they can't draw a straight line. I can't either. And it's fine. You can still create amazing works of art. Now, despite sort of lessening that out, you can kind of see the difference here, right? Like I thought that was pretty jarring. And so I sort of lightened it up just a little bit as it was descending back into its cavern of nothingness back here, where the light would sort of lose all of its luster, all of its glow. And then I brightened these up. So we're in, an ice cave. And so with a light source shining on it, ice, snow, those sorts of white substances more so than rock, are going to have a little bit more sort of brightness to them. And so I added a pop of bright to sort of indicate that sort of glow that they're going to have. And then I added this with the ground, thinking partly that the light source might be shining this way. As it hits the ground, it might be going a little further back. But also it helps lead us back into the cavern. I thought that was a really effective way to sort of guide us all the way back to the nothingness. Now, this composition in particular I really like because you have all of these jagged edges, right? So adding that jagged edge that descends into this nothingness, it creates a sense of unease with us. And so, playing around with the shapes of your composition, even for a landscape or a cave like this, can change the emotion. If it were just a barren cave, it might still kind of be a little spooky, but adding these not only adds a lot of detail, which I'm a big fan of adding detail into something. I think those little details like that can really elevate a composition in ways that you hadn't maybe anticipated. And it just sort of helps it pop in a way that maybe it wouldn't have otherwise. It might have been fine, but adding this makes it even spookier, even eerier, like you're sort of stuck in this cave or going into this abyss with all of these jagged lines pointing down at you and potentially indicating sort of danger to us. And then the last thing before I remove the background is I sign it always. And then we remove the drawing in the background. So the reason I remove this, right, like it almost looks like it could work and stay there. But sometimes I remove my background drawings if they interfere with the back edge of something, right? Like you can see the drawing here defining this shape, and I don't want that to happen because that shape, it's rounding into darkness. I don't want a bright line defining that for me. And the same is true for a lot of these lines up here. You can see it, how it comes around, how I define that shape, how I define this shape. And I don't want those lines to define the shape. I want the shadowing and the highlights to define the shape for me. So my initial sketch is getting in the way of that. It certainly helped, and I needed it while I was sketching, but it gets in the way of the final product, which is sort of this cave that things can round away from the light source in a way that's much more natural, and you don't have a line sort of dictating it for you. So, all right, so that is how you draw a cave. In the floating nether next to me, I have a couple videos of other art tutorials I've done, and don't forget that everyone can draw. So I will see you all soon. Take care. Thank you so much.